This is lecture 32. We want to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. I want to set this up by just mentioning briefly the early failures of the federal armies in the Eastern Theater. Historians divide the Civil War into Eastern and Western theaters. The Eastern Theater is essentially the battlefront in Virginia. I guess we'd include Maryland and Pennsylvania in that. The Western Theater is everything else. In the Eastern Theater, the federal armies, the Army of the Potomac, have one failure after another. The initial loss at Bull Run is terribly demoralizing to the North. The Peninsula Campaign, led by General George McClellan, is a terrible disappointment. It looked as if McClellan was perfectly positioned to end the war early and lacked the intestinal fortitude, I suppose, to carry out the sufficient attacks, even though his army was probably twice the size of the Confederate Army. There's a disaster at Second Bull Run, and Lincoln continues to shuffle generals, trying to find somebody who will fight and win. Terrible battle, one-day battle fought at Antietam in western Maryland in the late summer of 1862. Here, George McClellan and Robert E. Lee face off across the Antietam Creek, and this is probably the worst single day in American military history as far as casualties are concerned. McClellan launched a series of attacks against Lee's position, but these attacks were not coordinated. They were launched piecemeal. Lee was able to beat back these attacks, and indeed, as the next day dawned, Lee's much smaller army stood their ground, daring McClellan to renew his assaults. McClellan, of course, being timid and being, I don't know if timid is the word, perhaps just being overly cautious about spilling his own men's blood, McClellan declined to renew the attacks, allowing Robert E. Lee to escape back into Virginia. This, of course, was a terrible disappointment to President Lincoln. Lincoln believed that McClellan was in position to end the war here in September of 1862. But again, he failed to do so. However, Lincoln had prepared a document, the Emancipation Proclamation, that he wanted to issue on the occurrence of a Union victory. Now, out west, General Grant had some success pushing down from Kentucky into Tennessee at Fort Donelson, and further into the deep south at Shiloh, where a terrible battle was fought. But at least Grant had maintained the initiative and had kept his aggression, whereas McClellan had not. So Lincoln is looking for an opportunity to issue this Emancipation Proclamation. And since the battle at Antietam did at least stop Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North and force Lee to turn south and retreat back into Virginia, Lincoln took this opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This document has the tendency to change the nature of the war. The war began because of Southern secession and Southern aggression against federal installations. So Lincoln could quite plausibly say that the war was not being fought over slavery. It was being fought over union to maintain the integrity of the United States. Now we're 2 years into the war, and the Emancipation Proclamation changes the nature of the war. It's not so much now about maintaining the Union as it is abolishing slavery and maintaining the Union. Only the abolishment of slavery, it appears, would allow North and South to come back together and to reconcile. So the Emancipation Proclamation is significant because it does significantly change the very nature of the war, what's being fought for. Some of the things that the Emancipation Proclamation did, its impact on the South and on African American slaves, remember that it only impacts those slaves in the Deep South, those slaves that are outside the reach of federal armies, those slaves that the Union cannot physically free. Slaves in the border states are not freed. Lincoln has no wish to drive the border states into rebellion by tinkering with their domestic institutions. So the Emancipation Proclamation is in ways symbolic of the Union's intent to abolish slavery. And of course, it's a great propaganda tool as word spreads through the South that the President of the United States has abolished or has freed the slaves. And of course, rumor and gossip spread. Blacks realized that their freedom would come as federal armies moved through their territories. The Federal Army, is, in a sense, extended freedom as it moved further and further south. This, of course, increased slaves' abandonment of the plantations, which is going to impact the Southern economy and Southern way of life. Some Confederate soldiers say that they first heard of the Emancipation Proclamation from the slaves themselves. Slaves, through word of mouth, had discovered this remarkable document before Confederate soldiers. This document, of course, bans slavery, which takes England and France out of the mix. Now that the war is not simply a political struggle between North and South or between Union and so-called states' rights, now it's become a moral crusade, and the chances of England or France intervening on the side of the South are severely diminished. I think we should also mention that hundreds of thousands of slaves are not going to enlist in the Union armies. This, of course, is a nightmare for Southerners to see regular Army troops armed with their uniforms and commanders as Union soldiers in the war. A very frightening prospect, to say the least. My statistics say that over 100,000 former slaves enlisted in the United States Army during the Civil War. Lincoln himself defends emancipation. The emancipation turns the war into one of liberation. Lincoln says if slaves are the property of the enemy, then it is a proper war measure to take that property from the enemy, to weaken the enemy. It's a military necessity. Lincoln issues his demand that the South will surrender unconditionally. So let me sum this up by pointing out again that this is in many ways a symbolic gesture, because the slaves that are freed by the emancipation are those who cannot be physically freed. But the sheer symbolic importance of it spreads rapidly throughout the South, demoralizing the South, giving the slaves heart, encouraging slave enlistment in the Union armies, slave abandonment of the plantations. It reduces to zero the odds of any other nation, European or otherwise, coming in on the Southern side. It places the South, the Southern Confederacy, in utter isolation, politically and otherwise. And remember that the Union plan developed by General Scott before the war began, the so-called Anaconda Plan, and you can tell by the name of the plan that its intention is to strangle the South. The Southern economy is being strangled by the U.S. Navy that's blocking Southern ports. The Union strategy of seizing the Mississippi will be achieved in 1863. We'll talk about Vicksburg in a moment. And the other part of the Anaconda Plan, of course, is the capture of Richmond. This will not take place until 1865. But these three facets of the Anaconda Plan, in addition to the Emancipation Proclamation, tend to change the character of the war and make it a war of liberation and a war of a sort of a moral crusade, as I said before. So I'm going to stop there with the Emancipation, And we'll pick up our last lecture, which will be, I'm going to talk about 4 decisive campaigns of the war, and then we'll talk about Appomattox, the surrender that ends the war. Thank you.